The silent warning. The galaxy was calm, too calm. For years, the peaceful races of the galaxy lived in their isolated systems, never worrying about the distant dangers that once plagued them. But far beyond the borders of their known space, something stirred, something that none of them could yet understand. A single broken transmission had reached them. Its origin was far away, from the very edges of known space, and its message was both chilling and impossible to ignore. Help. Deathworlders, need your help. The message was brief, distorted by the vast distances it traveled, but it was clear enough. It spoke of a dire situation, one that sent ripples of fear throughout the galaxy. Who could possibly be in need of the Deathworlders? Those brutal, merciless warriors from the wildest worlds in the galaxy. The mere thought of them made most races shudder. They were feared and hated, known for their savage ways and unpredictable nature. Yet this message wasn't sent to their enemies. It wasn't a call for war. No, it was a plea for help. A plea from those who could never have imagined calling on the Deathworlders for assistance. Across the galaxy, communication hubs buzzed with frantic activity. The message was everywhere, but no one knew what to make of it. There was confusion and disbelief. Who would dare to summon the Deathworlders? And why? Were they allies, or had they become the new threat? On the peaceful planet of Audric, far from the galactic center, the Council of Peaceful Species convened. Their species had never faced the horrors that other races in the galaxy had experienced. Wars had passed them by. Diplomacy was their tool, their weapon. But now, as the message echoed in their chambers, the Council had no choice but to face a reality they had long forgotten. I can't believe this," said Elder Nera, the leader of Audric's council. She was an ancient being, wise and slow to react, but her eyes burned with fear. Deathworlders. They are not like us. They don't help. They conquer. Her voice was trembling, but there was more than just fear in her words. There was doubt. Doubt about what they were hearing. Doubt about how their universe was about to change. The younger members of the council argued. They questioned the authenticity of the message. It could have been a mistake, a trick. But Nera knew better. She had seen the destruction caused by Deathworlders in the past. She had seen the violence, the chaos they left behind when they arrived in a system. Their reputation was notorious. And yet this was different. A quiet hum filled the council room as they debated whether or not to respond. Would they ignore the call? Would they risk angering the unknown forces behind it? Or would they dare to send a response that could change everything? Nera stood, silence falling over the room. She looked out of the grand windows of the council chamber, where the stars glittered like cold diamonds in the vastness of space. Her voice broke through the stillness, and with a quiet but firm tone, she made a decision. We cannot ignore this. We must send a fleet, a small fleet, just in case. But we must act. We cannot risk leaving those who are asking for help to their fate, especially if the Deathworlders are involved. The council murmured in agreement, but there was no joy in the decision. Only a deep, sinking feeling in their collective hearts. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, whispers of the message were spreading. Leaders, scientists, and military figures alike pondered the implications of what they had just heard. The Deathworlders, the ones who had once been the great terror of the galaxy, could they truly be the answer to a desperate cry for help? In the militarized world of Teldar, a vast and powerful species known for their iron-fisted rule, General Torrens stood by his window, gazing out at the vast expanse of space. His thoughts were consumed by the same message. It echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was not just a random call. It was something more, something important. The Deathworlders, he muttered to himself. Why would anyone call on them for help? His fingers drummed lightly on the desk in front of him. It was a question that bothered him, one he couldn't answer. His military strategy and hardened nature told him to prepare for the worst, to gather troops and weapons. But his instincts, honed over years of war and conflict, warned him to stay cautious. The Deathworlders were unpredictable. They didn't follow the rules. They didn't care for diplomacy or alliances. They cared only for survival, and sometimes they fought for a cause they believed in. But what was the cause this time? Toren's mind raced with possibilities. A galaxy-wide war. A new, unstoppable enemy. The questions seemed endless. But one thing was clear. The galaxy would never be the same. The arrival of the Deathworlders was coming. No one could escape it. And as the stars continued to twinkle in the vastness of space, one thing echoed in the minds of every leader, every ruler, and every soldier. What could the Deathworlders do when they arrived? Would they be the galaxy's last hope, or its final destruction? The unknowns were too great to ignore. In every corner of the galaxy, the quiet hum of anticipation began to grow, and with it came the undeniable truth. Something was coming, and when the Deathworlders arrived, everything would change. The calm before the storm. The galaxy continued to hum with activity, but beneath the surface, tension had begun to spread like a creeping fog. It was the calm before the storm, silent, yet full of anticipation. The leaders and inhabitants of countless worlds looked toward the stars, unsure of what to expect. And somewhere, hidden in the vastness of space, the Deathworlder fleet was gathering. No one knew exactly when they would arrive or what they would bring with them. Would it be a force of destruction or salvation? Would the Deathworlders heed the call, or would they see it as an opportunity to conquer yet another helpless civilization? On the peaceful planet of Valor, the highest council had convened to discuss the growing uncertainty. The alien species that inhabited Valor had long prided themselves on their neutrality, their ability to stay out of the conflicts of the greater galaxy. But this was different. They couldn't ignore a cry for help that carried the unmistakable signature of the Deathworlders. "We must be ready," said Minister Alia, her eyes narrowed with concern. "Whatever happens, we must be prepared for the worst. The Deathworlders don't play by the same rules as we do. Their ways are brutal, unpredictable. If they answer this call, we may not survive." Her words struck the council like a blow, and for the first time in years, there was real fear in the room. Alia's people were known for their peaceful ways, their diplomacy. They had always found a way to avoid violence, but when it came to the Deathworlders, there was no negotiating, no reasoning. They were a force of nature, unstoppable and untamed. Meanwhile, in the military command center on Xantar, General Toren paced back and forth, his mind racing with the possibilities. He had received the same transmission, the same cryptic message that had rippled through the galaxy. The Deathworlders were coming, and no one knew what would happen when they did. He ran his fingers through his short-cropped hair, a habit when he was deep in thought. His instincts told him that the Deathworlders weren't interested in peace. They were warriors, survivors of the harshest worlds in the galaxy. They didn't care about the politics or alliances of the galaxy. They cared only for their own kind. But something about the message made him uneasy. The message had been clear. Help. Deathworlders need your help. There was desperation in those words, a cry that couldn't be ignored. Something had happened out there, something that had pushed even the Deathworlders to seek aid. And that scared him more than anything. What if this is a trap? General Toren muttered to himself. What if they're luring us into a false sense of security before they strike? His officers had made suggestions. Gather more intelligence, send out scouts, prepare a defense. But Toren couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was not the Deathworlders themselves. The true danger lay in what they had found, what had pushed them to break their silence and ask for help. Back on the peaceful world of Audric, Elder Nera sat quietly, reflecting on the message that had reached them. She had lived through many galactic crises, but this was unlike anything she had encountered before. The Deathworlders had always been a distant threat, something to fear, but never something that directly affected her people. But now, they were at the center of everything. Their arrival could change the fate of the galaxy. The silent hum of communication channels filled the room as she stared out into the starry expanse. She knew there was no turning back now. The Deathworlders would come. The galaxy's fate was in their hands. A decision had to be made. Would they respond to the call? Would they send aid or prepare for war? The consequences of either choice were unimaginable. The galaxy's leaders were no longer just afraid of the Deathworlders. They feared the unknown. What had driven them to seek help? What had happened to them that could make even the Deathworlders fear? And then it happened. A flash of light from the farthest reaches of the galaxy. It wasn't a star. It wasn't a comet. It was a ship. An enormous ship, unlike anything any of the peaceful races had ever seen. It appeared out of nowhere, blinking into existence as if it had always been there, waiting. The sight of it was enough to send ripples of panic through the communication channels. The Deathworlder fleet had arrived. The ship loomed like a mountain in space, its massive frame cutting through the stars with a grace that defied its size. The light reflected off its surface, creating a shimmering, almost ghostly effect. It was an awe-inspiring sight, and a terrifying one. For a brief moment, there was silence across the galaxy. No one moved. No one spoke. Every eye was fixed on the monitor screens, every mind racing with questions and fears. And then, as if on cue, the message came again. Deathworlders are here. The message was not an announcement, not a boast. It was simple, direct, and it sent a cold shiver down the spines of every leader, every soldier, every civilian watching from across the galaxy. The Deathworlders were here, and with their arrival, everything would chant the decision. The moment the Deathworlder fleet entered the galaxy's edge, everything seemed to freeze. Every species, from the smallest insectoid on the peaceful moon of Scylla to the towering humanoids on Earth, had their eyes glued to their screens. The stars, once familiar and comforting, now seemed cold and distant. The fleet's approach cast a shadow over the entire galaxy, one that stretched from star to star. In every corner of the galaxy, the same question lingered. Why were they here? In the great war rooms and council chambers, the discussions were growing heated. The message from the Deathworlders had been clear, but it left too many unanswered questions. Was this a moment of opportunity? Or was it a harbinger of something far worse? Many feared that their arrival could mean the end of the peaceful order they had built over countless generations. At the Galactic Assembly, representatives from over a dozen species sat in tense silence. The room, a grand structure made of translucent materials that allowed the distant stars to shine through, seemed to pulse with the anxiety of the gathered diplomats. As the leader of the assembly, Velis, spoke, her voice was firm, but a flicker of uncertainty passed through her eyes. "We must make a decision," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Do we offer our help to the Deathworlders, or do we prepare for battle?" The council chambers erupted in chaos as leaders argued back and forth. The Valens, a race of peaceful scholars, wanted to offer immediate aid, but the Zorvek, a race known for their militaristic ways, were more cautious. If they wanted help, they would have asked for it a long time ago. Zorvek's General Arak snapped, his voice filled with disdain. "We have no choice but to prepare for war. These Deathworlders will only bring destruction. You underestimate them, Arak." Velis replied sharply. "We don't know why they are here. What if they're not enemies, but victims themselves?" The debate raged on, but no one had an answer. The fleet loomed closer, its dark silhouette cutting across the stars. At the same time, deep in the heart of the Deathworlder fleet, something extraordinary was unfolding. The Deathworlders weren't just arriving with weapons and warships. No, their fleet was something different. A massive network of ships, from tiny scouts to enormous battle carriers. But there was an unexpected element. Peacekeepers. In between the massive warships, smaller vessels designed for humanitarian aid, medical relief, and even agricultural assistance could be seen. It was a paradox that baffled everyone. These were not just conquerors, not just destroyers. These were beings that had endured the harshest conditions known to the galaxy. They had survived apocalyptic worlds and fought countless battles, but their fleet was carrying more than just weapons. It carried hope, in the form of doctors, engineers, and workers who were ready to help rebuild whatever had been destroyed. Across the galaxy, the truth began to spread. The Deathworlders had not come to conquer. They had come to save. On the distant planet of Riva, a species of highly intelligent amphibians observed the fleet's arrival through their advanced telescopes. The leader of the Rivan people, Supreme Elder Corsa, stood before a council of her most trusted advisors. "It seems the Deathworlders are not here to destroy," Corsa said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her heart. "They are offering something we did not expect, a chance for survival." "But what is the price?" one advisor asked, his voice shaky. "Can we trust them? What if they are simply luring us in to turn on us when we are most vulnerable?" Corsa paused, deep in thought. She knew the Deathworlders were unpredictable, and yet she could feel something different about their presence. There was no aggression in their arrival, only a solemn duty. Something had happened to them, something that had turned these warriors of death into protectors. "We don't know what lies ahead," Corsa said slowly, her eyes gazing out at the fleet. "But we must ask ourselves, can we afford to ignore them, or are we willing to take a chance, one that could change the fate of our people?" Meanwhile, back at the Galactic Assembly, tensions were at an all-time high. Velis could feel the pressure building in the room. The fate of the galaxy was about to be decided, and there was no room for hesitation. She needed to act now. "Prepare for an official message," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "We will respond to the Deathworlders. We cannot allow fear to dictate our future." But even as the decision was being made, another, darker truth began to emerge. In the deepest reaches of space, beyond the reach of any monitoring systems, something else had been watching the Deathworlder fleet. A presence, ancient and unfathomable, stirred. It had seen the fleet's arrival, and it had its own plans. The galaxy was on the brink of a new chapter, one that would see alliances formed and old wounds healed. But it would also see the rise of a new threat, one that no one had foreseen. And in the dark corners of the galaxy, those who had been waiting for a moment like this were preparing to act. The true battle was about to begin. The decision. The days following the Deathworlder fleet's arrival were filled with uncertainty, and the galaxy was now gripped by a collective sense of anticipation. For weeks, rumors spread faster than any ships could travel, and every planet, every species, seemed to be debating the same question. Are the Deathworlders truly here to help? And if so, what did they want in return? The Galactic Assembly, a sprawling hub of politics, diplomacy, and interstellar affairs, was now a pressure cooker. Every species and race had sent their representatives, all eager to voice their concerns, offer solutions, and, in some cases, demand answers. The fate of the galaxy was in the balance, and Velis, the leader of the assembly, knew that time was running out. Behind closed doors, the discussions grew more heated. Each leader had their own take on the Deathworlders. Some were ready to open their doors and offer any assistance necessary, while others feared the unknown. Would they be conquerors, as the Zorvik military feared, or would they truly be saviors? In the chamber center, Velis stood, looking out over the delegates, her hands resting lightly on the podium. She felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her, every leader hoping for guidance. Her voice broke the silence. "We must come to a decision. The Deathworlders are not waiting, and neither can we." The room went quiet, the tension so thick it seemed to suffocate the air. Every species, from the peaceful Terradans to the war-hardened Valens, had their say. But in the end, it was clear. The galaxy had no choice but to face what was coming. And Velis knew this was just the beginning. Some of us believe the Deathworlders may be our salvation, while others think their arrival is a precursor to something far worse. But we must act now, before it's too late. Her words hung heavy in the air, and the room fell into silence once more. The decision, it seemed, would not be made easily. But there was one thing that everyone could agree on. They needed to find out the truth. In the heart of the Deathworlder fleet, General Kresh of the Rikthar warship watched from his command center as the massive ships filled the stars above. It was a sight he had never thought possible, a fleet of their size and strength. Yet the most surprising part was not the fleet's power. It was the compassion and resources it carried with it. Humanitarian ships, research vessels, and supplies had been part of the fleet's cargo, proving that the Deathworlders were not merely conquerors. They had come to help. But why? Kresh stared at the massive holographic map in front of him, filled with 1,000,000 different data points. They had arrived here with only one purpose: to answer a call for help. But who had called? And why had it been so urgent? "We'll find out soon enough," Kresh muttered to himself, his voice low and determined. "But we cannot afford to waste any more time. The galaxy is on the edge of chaos." While Velis and the Assembly debated their next move, another force was silently at work. Far beyond the reach of the galactic fleets, in the depths of an ancient, long-forgotten sector, something stirred. The Tsalok, a race of cold, calculating beings who had been watching the galaxy for millennia, had noticed the Deathworlder fleet's arrival. And they were not pleased. For centuries, the Tsalok had maintained their control over vast swaths of space, manipulating events from the shadows. They had kept the galaxy in a fragile balance, ensuring that no one species could rise too far above the rest. The Deathworlders' sudden appearance, with their mix of strength and compassion, threatened that balance. From their hidden base, deep in the blackness of space, the Tsalok's most trusted commanders gathered. Their leader, the enigmatic Elder Trask, stood at the head of a table surrounded by his advisors. "They are moving too quickly." Trask's voice was calm, but laced with fury. "The Deathworlders cannot be allowed to disrupt the established order. We have waited too long for this galaxy to fall into chaos. Now, with their arrival, it is only a matter of time before everything unravels." One of Trask's commanders, a sharp-eyed Tsalok named Zale, spoke up. "But they are not acting as invaders. We've analyzed their movements. They are offering peace, medical aid, technology. And that is what makes them dangerous," Trask interrupted. "Their offers are laced with poison. The galaxy will grow too comfortable with them. They will take root, and when they have gathered enough influence, they will strike. They cannot be allowed to grow any further." Zale's eyes widened as the reality of Trask's words settled in. If the Deathworlders were allowed to gain too much ground, the Tsalok's careful plans for control would be undone. "We must act before they establish themselves as heroes," Trask continued. "We will ensure the galaxy rejects them, and we will do it by any means necessary." Back in the Galactic Assembly, Velis and the leaders finally reached a tentative decision. An envoy would be sent to meet with the Deathworlders to understand their true intentions, but unknown to them, this decision would set the galaxy on a path that no one could predict. As the Deathworlders prepared for the meeting, they knew this was the moment. It was the culmination of their long journey, the moment they would prove their purpose to the galaxy. But even as they took their first steps toward peace, an invisible hand, with plans of its own, was already moving. And the future of the galaxy was about to take a sharp turn, one that no one could have foreseen. The tension builds. The silence that followed the decision was oppressive, like the calm before a storm. The Galactic Assembly had decided. An envoy would meet with the Deathworlders, but there was a sense of unease in the air. Would this be the beginning of a new era of peace, or would it be the beginning of something darker, something no one could have foreseen? Velis had done her best to keep control of the situation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy was standing at the edge of a precipice. She had seen the reports. The Deathworlder fleet wasn't just vast, it was diverse. There were ships of all sizes, from massive warships to smaller medical vessels, and everything in between. But what struck her the most was the sheer range of species in their ranks. Different races, different backgrounds, yet they all shared one common trait. They had come to answer the call. The envoy, led by Ambassador Karis, would travel to the Deathworlder flagship to speak with their leaders. Karis was known for her diplomatic skills, but even she couldn't shake the sense of foreboding. She had read the reports, seen the images of the Deathworlder fleet, and heard the rumors that circulated in the assembly. There were whispers that these aliens might not be as benevolent as they seemed. As Karis prepared to leave for the rendezvous, she took a moment to gather her thoughts in the quiet of her chambers. She was facing the unknown, and no amount of preparation could change that. She had to be careful with her words, for they would be the first spoken between the galaxy's leadership and the Deathworlders. "We've waited for this moment for so long," she murmured to herself, standing by the window and gazing out at the sprawling spaceport. The ships that filled the sky were a reminder of the stakes. The galaxy, despite all its divisions, would have to come together if they were to survive whatever the Deathworlders had in store. Outside her window, she saw a flash of movement, an unknown ship moving toward the assembly dock. Its sleek, dark design made it almost blend into the backdrop of space. It wasn't from any known species in the galaxy, and Karis wondered for a brief moment if it was just a trick of the light. But no, the movement was deliberate, controlled. The dark ship was unmistakable, and its arrival signified more than just an unexpected visitor. It meant something was approaching, something that the galaxy would have to deal with, whether they were ready or not. For Karis, this was just another sign that the clock was ticking down, and the future of everything she had fought for was hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, the Deathworlder fleet continued to position itself at the edge of the galaxy, near the borders of unknown space. Their commanders, including General Kresh, were preparing for the meeting with the Galactic Assembly, though their thoughts were far from peaceful. Kresh's ship, the Rikhthar, moved silently through the void, its sleek, black hull cutting through the stars. He had seen the reports too. The galaxy was divided on how to deal with them. Some were welcoming, offering aid and cooperation. But others, most notably the Zorvik military, were more suspicious, and that made Kresh nervous. The Deathworlders had come with the best of intentions, but even they knew that not everyone would be so open to their help. "Status report," Kresh ordered, his voice low and firm. His second in command, a seasoned officer named Lyra, immediately complied. "Admiral, the envoys are preparing to depart from the assembly station. We've intercepted no hostile movements from the galaxy's fleets. However, we are receiving strange signals from an uncharted region near the edge of known space. It's likely that something, wants to stop this meeting from happening." Kresh's gaze hardened. "Increase our alert status. If anyone dares to interfere, they'll regret it." Lyra nodded, her eyes narrowing with determination. "Understood, Admiral." The Deathworlders had not come this far just to be turned away. They had a mission. No, a responsibility. And they would not let anyone stop them. Back in the Galactic Assembly, Velis watched the preparations from her office. Despite all her political experience, she had a gnawing feeling in her gut. She knew that not everyone would accept the Deathworlders' arrival, and the tension in the air was palpable. The entire galaxy was watching. If the meeting went well, peace could be within reach. If it went wrong, Velis didn't dare think of the consequences. The final countdown was beginning. The envoy would leave the assembly station and head toward the Deathworlder flagship. The next few days would define the future of the galaxy. But what no one knew, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that there were forces at work beyond their control, forces that would shape the outcome of this meeting and possibly the fate of the galaxy. As the ship carrying Karis and the envoy prepared for departure, a shadow loomed over the galaxy's fragile hopes. The silent hand of the Tsalok was already at work. From their hidden base, the Tsalok were watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They had already made their move. The Deathworlders' arrival could not be allowed to go unchallenged. The galaxy had been in their hands for too long, and they would not allow a band of so-called heroes to upend everything they had built. The Tsalok's hidden agents, scattered across the galaxy, had already begun their work. The galaxy would have to face something far more insidious than just a fleet of powerful warriors. The real battle, The one that would determine the galaxy's fate had already begun, and no one knew it. The unseen hand. The rendezvous between the Galactic Assembly and the Deathworlder fleet was only a matter of hours away. Karis, the ambassador, sat in a quiet room aboard the envoy ship, staring at the holographic displays in front of her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Despite the promises of peace, despite the grand hopes for a new era, there was an undercurrent of tension she couldn't ignore. Her fingers hovered over the controls as she studied the final communications from the assembly. The messages were clear. They were to approach the Deathworlder flagship with the utmost caution, but they were also encouraged to form a strong alliance. But as the hours ticked by, she couldn't help but feel the heavy weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The fate of the galaxy rested in her hands, and yet it felt like the universe itself was conspiring against them. Outside the observation deck, the stars stretched out like an endless sea of light. They passed through nebulae and asteroid belts, the ship's sleek design cutting through space with ease. Karis watched as the stars danced by, her mind racing with what lay ahead. "They say the galaxy is made of possibilities," she murmured softly to herself. "But no one told me that some possibilities are more dangerous than others." On the bridge, her crew prepared for the final approach to the Deathworlder fleet. They had received the confirmation. The Deathworlders had made the rendezvous coordinates known, and all ships were on alert. Karis had already briefed them on the importance of this mission, but there was still an air of uncertainty among the crew. They, too, could feel the growing tension that gripped the galaxy. "We're entering the Deathworlders' territory now, Ambassador," said Lieutenant Varric, the ship's tactical officer. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his nerves. Karis turned toward him. Her expression hardened. "I know. Let's stay focused." The tension grew as the massive fleet of the Deathworlders loomed ahead. Hundreds of ships, each one more formidable than the last, were docked in the starry expanse, their dark forms casting shadows over the smaller ships of the envoy. The Deathworlders had arrived in full force. Their ships didn't gleam with polished metal like the other fleets Karis had encountered. Instead, they exuded a harsh, battle-worn presence, a stark contrast to the sleek designs of the galactic ships. Karis could feel her heart rate quicken. The stories of the Deathworlders had always painted them as a dangerous, unpredictable force. Now, standing before them, it was hard to ignore the weight of that history. But there was no turning back. She was already committed. The future of the galaxy depended on this meeting, and she would do everything in her power to make it work. But what none of them knew was that something darker, something far more insidious, was watching them from the shadows. Hidden in the far reaches of space, the Tsalok had already put their plan into motion. They knew that the meeting between the Deathworlders and the Galactic Assembly could lead to a new era, or to their downfall. They would not allow it to succeed. The Tsalok had infiltrated the farthest corners of the galaxy, manipulating those who would serve their cause. Their agents were everywhere, hidden within the ranks of those who would meet the Deathworlders. They had set up systems to monitor the diplomatic mission, and to strike when the moment was right. Karis' thoughts were interrupted as her comms officer spoke urgently. "Ambassador, we've just intercepted a message. Encrypted, but it's from one of our own ships. It's not good." She turned toward the officer, her heart sinking. "What's the message?" "It's from the Zorvik fleet," the officer said, his voice trembling. "They're making a move. They intend to disrupt the meeting. They've already fired on a smaller convoy headed for the Deathworlder flagship." The message was clear. The Zorvik military, one of the galaxy's most powerful and aggressive factions, wasn't interested in diplomacy. They had long feared the Deathworlders and their power, and they would stop at nothing to prevent the alliance from forming. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Karis ordered immediately, her voice sharp with command. "Send word to the Deathworlders. We're under attack." As the crew scrambled to respond, Karis turned her attention to the view outside. The Deathworlder fleet remained silent, watching as the galaxy's diplomacy began to unravel before it even began. Karis had hoped for a peaceful resolution, but she feared the worst. In the deep reaches of space, the Deathworlder fleet stirred. They had been watching, waiting for this moment. They had come not just as rescuers, but as protectors of the galaxy. And now, with the Zorvak attack, their true purpose was about to be revealed. On the bridge of the Deathworlder flagship, General Kresh stood, his posture straight and unwavering as he observed the unfolding events. His mind raced as he assessed the situation. The galaxy was already in chaos, but it would take more than a few rogue factions to derail their mission. "Signal all ships," Kresh commanded, his voice low but resolute. "We're moving in." Within moments, the Deathworlder fleet powered into action, their engines glowing brighter than the stars themselves. The ships moved like a single, coordinated entity, an unstoppable force ready to defend and protect. They had arrived not just to save the galaxy, but to restore order to a system on the brink of destruction. As the fleet moved to intercept the Zorvak aggressors, Karis watched with a sense of awe and fear. The Deathworlders weren't just warriors, they were protectors, and now the fate of the galaxy rested in their hands. But even as the fleet advanced, an unseen hand moved in the shadows. The Xalak were waiting, biding their time. The galaxy had no idea what was coming, and the Deathworlders would soon realize that their fight was far from over. The battle for the galaxy's future. The tension in the command room was palpable. Karis stood at the front, watching as the screens flashed with chaotic data. Zorvak ships had engaged the convoy, and the situation was deteriorating fast. The Zorvak were known for their brutal tactics, and now they had the Deathworlders to contend with. Karis felt the weight of her position, but she had no time for self-doubt. This was it, the moment everything had led up to. "Status report," she barked at the comms officer, trying to steady her breath. "Ambassador, the Deathworlder fleet has responded," the officer reported, his voice steady despite the chaos. "They're intercepting the Zorvak vessels. We're also receiving encrypted messages from the Deathworlder flagship." Karis leaned forward, anxiety creeping into her chest. "What are they saying?" "The Deathworlders are on their way to assist the convoy. The Zorvak are refusing to disengage," the officer replied. "They've initiated a full-scale assault." Karis' stomach turned. The galaxy was teetering on the edge of disaster, and it seemed like the very people they had hoped to trust were now embroiled in a brutal war. Suddenly, the comms officer's voice broke through the tension. "Ambassador, incoming transmission from General Kresh of the Deathworlder fleet." She quickly signaled for the feed to be connected. A holographic image of General Kresh materialized in front of her, his expression stoic, his eyes betraying no emotion as he assessed the situation. "Karis, we've engaged the Zorvak. It's a full-scale skirmish, but we'll hold our ground." Kresh's voice boomed from the projection. "We will not let them disrupt this peace." Karis nodded, though she could feel the pressure mounting. The Zorvak's firepower was formidable, but the Deathworlders had the advantage of experience. This wasn't just a fight for the galaxy's future, it was a fight for survival. "General," she said, her voice steady despite the rising panic. "What's the next step? How do we ensure the Assembly's representatives can reach the Deathworlder flagship?" Kresh paused, and for the first time, a shadow of uncertainty passed through his eyes. "We have to clear the path. The convoy can't move until the Zorvak threat is neutralized. But the real danger lies in what's coming next. The Zorvak are just the beginning." "What do you mean?" Karis asked, her pulse quickening. "Trust me when I say this," Kresh replied, his voice grave. "There's something much darker at play here. The Zorvak are just pawns. The true enemy is lurking in the shadows." Karis felt a chill run down her spine. The galaxy had already been at war for so long, but now it seemed like the stakes were even higher. The Deathworlders weren't just here to stop the Zorvak. They were fighting something far more insidious, something that had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "We'll hold off the Zorvak as long as we can," Kresh continued. "But I suggest you prepare for what's coming next. Once this battle is won, we'll need to face a greater threat, one that could change everything." Karis nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. She looked out the window of the ship, watching as the deathly silhouette of the Deathworlder flagship approached. There was no turning back now. Whatever the Deathworlders were truly facing, they would have to face it together. The sounds of distant explosions echoed through the ship's hull, rattling the crew, but no one flinched. The Deathworlders were engaged, and they weren't about to back down. Back on the Deathworlder flagship, General Kresh turned to his officers, his face resolute. "We will protect the convoy at all costs," he declared, his voice carrying a sense of unshakable authority. "But know this, there is a storm approaching, one that will change everything we've fought for." As the Deathworlder ships powered toward the Zorvik fleet, the galaxy's fate seemed to hang in the balance. Karis knew that whatever came next, the galaxy would never be the same. But even as the battle raged on, the hidden force watching from the shadows prepared for the final move. The Taluk had waited long enough. The time to strike was nearing. The Deathworlders may have been the galaxy's last hope, but the true battle was just beginning. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the galaxy was about to face its greatest challenge. Would the Deathworlders be able to protect it, or would the unseen forces that lurked in the dark swallow the galaxy whole? Only time would tell.